I actually am going to tell very briefly my favorite Energy and Commerce Committee story before Chairman Waxman was chairman. It was when I think it was Bliley, when I was first covering the committee. And I'm only telling you this story just so you understand something about how hard it was to lead this committee. It was 2:00 in the morning on the second day. Some of you will remember this tortured markup, a Medicaid markup in around 94, 95, 96, something like that, 2 a.m. And the chairman, Chairman Bliley, said that he wants to apply the 5-minute rule on tabled amendments. So that jargon means they're supposed to only talk about an amendment for 5 minutes. Forget it, they talk for hours. He only wanted to apply it at 2 a.m. on the second day to amendments that they all knew were being tabled. In other words, the ones that didn't really matter except to make a point. And Sherry Brown then said, I move to make it retroactive. And the committee voted it down. So years later, that's what he had to, that was his subcommittee, and then as chairman of the committee, that was his milieu. It's like way harder than being a mother. So, so we have you know about the book. It's really began. This is Bruce Wolpe and Bryan Marshall. Bruce was a staffer in the 1970s originally.
Yes.
Went all the way to Australia to work for the Prime Minister there for many years, and continues to work for the ex-Prime Minister Julia Gillard. Is it Gillard? Came back because the call of history, namely the election of President Obama,
yes,
summoned him. He wanted to be here. He wanted to be at the White House.
I did.
A longtime aide said, no, you need to go back to Energy and Commerce.
Yes.
And his collaborator in this book is Bryan Marshall, who is a political scientist at Miami University in Ohio, who has also worked on the Hill and understands, like, it's not even sausage, it's worse than sausage, right? And of course, you all know Chairman Waxman, who served from, you were a Watergate baby, so 75 until 4 years ago?
40 years later.
And made his mark on many pieces of legislation, but probably the one that you hold dearest is the Affordable Care Act, right? Mm-hmm. Or you only said that at Spotlight Health.
I don't choose between my children.
You only said that at a health audience, right? So I think one of the first things that that really struck me is you left the committee in 81, you left the country in 91, you came back in 2000, late 2008, 2009.
Yes.
And back to Congress, and Congress had changed, ENC had changed. What were some of the things that struck you as you began to really take on a really ambitious...
Well, a lot of things were underway that are kind of inseparable, and they coalesced into a massive mandate to do things. You had the emergence of Barack Obama and his election, and if you cast your mind back, I know it's hard from where we sit right today to think back about what those days were like. It was a remarkable campaign in which we invested our hopes and aspirations, and we wanted a better country. And you had Republican rule of the Congress for a very long time. And there was pent-up demand, emotion, intellect, power to really make some profound change in a whole range of areas and advance the country. And these constellations aligned with Henry becoming chair by a vote in the caucus of a new generation of leadership closely aligned with the president and more effective in working as a partner to enact his agenda. And you had a House leadership, Nancy Pelosi, and the others in the leadership. Everyone was together in tackling this agenda. So when, okay, whoever can, okay. Is that a little bit better? A little bit? So when I saw this happening, my wife Leslie Russell, who had worked on the Commerce Committee in the 80s as well, when we saw this opportunity arise, we said we want to be a part of it. And I did speak to Phil Shaliro, a longtime aide to Henry, and who became Obama's legislative director. And he said, Henry's going to become chairman of the committee. Most of Obama's agenda is going to go through the committee. Let's strengthen his hand, and you can help do that in a way. And so become a part. And it's true. Most of Obamacare, cap and trade, tobacco, consumer protection legislation, oversight. And oversight is where, in years of opposition, Henry made his mark. when Democrats came back, and he could show what was the misgovernment under the Bush administration. So the opportunity to be a part of that, fantastic. Now, what had changed from the early days? In the early days, Democrats and Republicans kind of talked to each other. And you could, we had strong majorities in the 70s when you were elected, in the 80s, and half the Republicans would ultimately vote for bills when you were chairman of the Health Subcommittee. And you could work together. That broke down. And then the rise of special interests and the money that pollutes this city, that was evident. So the really interesting thing to me in that respect was you had bitter partisanship, but that a chairman like Henry Waxman could navigate the special interests and not allow them to defeat the agenda because of astute leadership and appreciation of politics driven by the substance. That's what made it really special and why it was a special moment in history. And I don't care what people say now, we accomplished a lot, and a lot of it is valued now, and is valued now more because of Trump. So for all those reasons, that's what I saw come together.
One of the big differences, well, first of all, I think can you briefly explain to those who didn't, the handful of people who might not have ever worked for ENC, the range of the range of the jurisdiction, the breadth.
I'd like Bryan too.
Why don't you talk, Bryan? See if your lav works?
Well, the chairman sitting here to correct me if I get this wrong, but I mean,
but how does it also?
I'm not the only one who will correct you. We got a lot of
sure,
other people.
I mean, when I teach the Congress class and we talk about committees and jurisdictions, Energy and Commerce is one I point to, that the jurisdiction of that committee is the Leviathan. I mean, it's a Goliath. And so it has a breadth of policy jurisdiction like only the Appropriations Committee has a similar kind of breadth of different policy areas that it touches. And so from energy, health, communications, technology. I mean, so it's an incredible breadth and depth to its jurisdiction, and it's one of the reasons over the years that party leadership, I think, have paid a lot of attention to it, because it does hit on those kinds of issues that can move the needle with national constituencies because of the importance of the policies in that jurisdiction. So it's an incredibly important, if not the most important, kind of policy committee in Congress.
And when I was reading the book, I sort of forgot how much this committee did in a very, very short period of time. Any of those bills were enormously big, complicated bills. The Affordable Care Act, which I'm most familiar with, tobacco, which I'm also quite familiar with, since his staff used to run around handing me documents in the basement of Rayburn. The cap and trade, which did pass the House and then failed in the Senate, and then also I'd totally forgotten that was also the BP water spill, the Deep Horizon oil spill, which also tied into cap and trade in certain ways, brought the issues back. Just enormous amount, plus grand bargains and Medicaid and entitlements and budgets and all the normal things. I mean, the amount, as I was reading, I sort of forgot how much of an enormous legislative, how much was squished in really monumental pieces of legislation, complicated pieces of legislation. So working for the committee, I mean, how do you have why don't you sort of explain how do you have the technical expertise, and how does a committee, any one of those, it took me 20 years to understand Obamacare, and I still have to Google things all the time. So how do you...
It has to be an exaggeration. 20 years? It hasn't been...
90, health policy.
Healthcare.
I started with 94. I came in the middle of the Clinton
Hillary bill.
plan. I came in 94, so I missed all the briefings, so I was very confused for a year. So how did you prioritize these? Any one of these things was a monumental issue. So how did the two of you decide what to do first?
Well,
or did the president tell you?
The chair decided what to do.
How did you decide?
No, there are two things. I think like attracts like. In other words, if you have an excellent chair or CEO or whatever, they will attract excellent people to work with them. But secondly, we had a staff director in Phil Barnett, who's here, who absolutely assembled a top-rate staff across all disciplines. And you could see it in all the internal work leading into a hearing, and particularly an oversight hearing. It was substantive engagement with the issues. You had to intellectually understand it. You had to understand the policy choices and what was behind it. And then on oversight issues, you had to understand, well, what problem are you looking at and what caused that problem? And that had to stand up to withering scrutiny by the industry that's affected and by the Republicans and everybody, and journalists, everybody else. So it required an intellectual depth, and that team was assembled. It was an all-star team. They didn't play last night. They played in the 111th, and they were really good.
Chairman Waxman, you had a president who had a mandate, who had really stimulated hopes for change, who was, we were immediately talking about a transformational president, which he was, and we end up having another transformational president who's transforming things in a different direction. They're both be historical figures. You had a choice of, you had a huge amount, you were the new chairman, you had a huge array of issues to pick. What was the role of the White House, you as chairman, and Nancy Pelosi as speaker, in figuring out what to do first? And do you regret the order you chose?
No, I don't have any regrets about what we did. I have regrets about what others have done. Phil Burnett was our staff director. Karen Nelson was the director of the health area. I'm going to mess up if I start naming names. Nora Mail came back and helped me in the personal office. And then throughout, I see people who were working for the committee at different times in specialized areas. We had excellent staff who really knew Medicare, Medicaid, all the environmental laws from the Clean Air Act, which we revised after a long, long battle. So we had good people in place to figure out the best policy. And it didn't happen when I became chairman. It happened in the many decades before. How did we decide to prioritize once I became chairman? Well, I became chairman out of the natural order of things, because the natural order of things is seniority. And the most senior member of the committee, the chairman and the ranking member for many, many decades, was John Dingell. He became chairman again when the Democrats won back the House in 2006. And in 2008, however, Barack Obama became president, and so much of his agenda was going to be determined by our committee. And I decided to run for that chairmanship, not with any hostility to John Dingell, but with the argument that I could do a better job on those key issues that were going to come before us. And I won the chairmanship. The two highest priorities vis-a-vis the White House was environmental issues. What do we do about climate change? And could we do something to bring in economic forces to reduce the greenhouse gases through a cap and trade system? There we relied on work that had been done by an organization made up of CEOs of major corporations, the environmentalists, and we use that as the basis for our legislation. In the area of the Affordable Care Act, or what is now known as the Affordable Care Act, we looked to the White House. And President Obama came in wanting to use his position to get something done, but he recognized the failures in the past. And one of the most recent dramatic failures was the inability of the Clinton administration to get national health care bill passed. They tried, they failed, and I think the president looked at the reasons for the failure and to try, as he did, to analyze how to avoid those failures and enlist Republicans. There's a major piece of legislation you didn't mention, and that was what was called the stimulus bill. As soon as the president took office, he wanted legislation to stimulate the economy. We were in a deep hole as the economy failed in 2008. and in a recession that could have turned into another Great Depression, and he wanted to use that opportunity to get the economy moving. That was not a new thing. There was a stimulus for the economy when there was a downturn under President George Bush. That passed on a bipartisan basis. Economists, Democrat and Republican, liberal and conservative, all argued we needed a stimulus bill. But that was the first indication when the president proposed it that the Republicans were going to take a position of opposing everything, even though their economists were saying we need a stimulus bill. And the stimulus bill had enormous parts to it. We had more money to the NIH. We had more money for a lot of things within our jurisdiction. And it was a major piece of legislation that if we had taken the parts of it, each of some of those parts might have been considered a major piece of legislation in and of itself. Republicans opposed it. President Obama invited Republicans and Democrats to the White House to be there on the ground floor in the development of the Affordable Care Act. Republicans came over to me afterwards and said, "This is great. We never were invited to the White House to be on the ground floor of any legislation when Bush was president, and here President Obama is bringing us in." But after that, they opposed it. They had made a decision, which I didn't quite understand right away, but it was a decision that became very obvious when Senator McConnell said his objective as the Republican leader of the Senate was to make sure that Obama did not have a second term. And they decided as a party to oppose everything. Well, we had two major bills, the Affordable Care Act, or access to health care for the millions of people that couldn't get insurance because they didn't get it through their job, they didn't get it through Medicare, they weren't on Medicaid, and they had to go to the individual insurance market, which discriminated against people who had pre-existing medical conditions and if you couldn't afford it. We were building on what was in place, and President Obama took a lot of the ideas Republicans had advanced in the past. A lot of what was in the Affordable Care Act was similar to what Senate Leader Dole had put up as an opposition to the Clinton proposal. And so he said, let's build on that, let's revise it. He wanted to bring the Republicans in, but the Republicans wouldn't cooperate, they wouldn't be part of it. He wanted to do something in environment, but that was a lower priority than health care. And I met with President Obama, and I said, well, we want to move forward on the avoidance of the climate change problems. And while we're trying to figure out the health care bill, I think we could move forward on that because otherwise we're sitting around waiting for the health care bill to be developed. So we advanced the cap and trade bill based on that previous coalition's recommendations. It was a struggle. President Obama said to me, you know, I want both of these bills to pass, but it's like choosing between your children. Healthcare is, he in effect said, more important to him than the environmental bill, and he didn't want us moving forward on the environmental bill in a way that might hurt the healthcare bill. And I said to him, well, I don't think it would. If we get a victory in the House on the environmental bill, victories lead to other victories, and then I think it will even make it easier for us on the healthcare bill. That was what I argued. We passed the cap and trade bill, the Waxman-Markey bill, that legislation before the June recess, May recess, something early in the year.
Yeah.
And is it July? The official spokesperson for is Phil Barnett. And he said in July, we then decided we'd move forward on the Affordable Care Act. Now, the way the Affordable Care Act was prepared was unlike the Clinton administration, where they had some people figure it all out, hand it to the Congress, and said, pass it. That might have been what happened during the New Deal, but it wasn't what the Congress was willing to do in the early 90s. And we had committee chairs who thought that they could decide policy on their own, and they would come up with different proposals. So the Ways and Means Committee was working on a version of the Clinton bill. The Energy and Commerce was working on a different version. The Senate committees were working on a different version. And one of the things that the Obama administration legislative shop, headed by Phil Shaliro, who had some knowledge about how Congress worked, and particularly our committee, said, let's get the committees in sync on an overall proposal, and then they can come with their different proposals, but let's get in sync on how we wanted to construct this. And we had committee staffers from the Senate, from the House, the different committees in the House, different committees in the Senate, try to develop a basic bill. And then the committees would work out the details and pass what they could, and it would be reconciled when the bill would go to the House floor and the Senate floor. So our thinking was, the environmental bill passed early. We would get on to the health care bill. The Senate would do the health care bill by summer. And then we would, while we're reconciling the health care bill, they can then move forward on the environmental bill. However, in the Senate, Chairman Max Baucus wanted to have a bipartisan bill. Even though the Republicans were talking about working with him, but he still had hope that he could get them to work on a bipartisan bill. We saw pretty clearly that wasn't not going to happen. And so he took an inordinate amount of time, and his bill in the Senate didn't pass until Christmas Eve at the end of 2009, which gave an opportunity for the what do they call themselves? Not the know-nothings.
Tea Party.
Tea Party.
The Tea Party people.
The deplorables.
No, I won't go that far. And they were going to district meetings for members of the House and the Senate, stirring everybody up. But we didn't have a health bill yet. So they were making up what they said was going to be in the health bill, like
We
the
all know
death
death
panels.
panels were in there, right?
What's that?
We all knew the death
Death
panels were going to
panels.
be in there, right?
So it put us in a defensive posture to defend the health bill that hadn't been worked out yet. And they weren't working on the environmental bill. So we had to move forward on our version of the ACA, which we adopted. Phil, when did we adopt it? ACA,
In July, before the August recess, end of July.
that was the healthcare bill?
Yeah.
And climate was June, right before the July recess.
Okay, so
you
we
had a-
we had June for the climate bill, July for the healthcare bill, and the Senate was potchking around, if anybody knows the term.
Everybody who worked for you must.
No, that wasn't a requirement. And they weren't doing anything while they were trying to figure out what to do on healthcare bill that didn't pass till later.
Was that partisanship when you came back after the 25-year gap? How quickly did that hit you in the face, even on a staff personal level? I mean, it's real. I mean, and as partisan as it was in 2009, it's nothing like it is now.
Right.
But 2009, things already were getting pretty partisan. So
It was just palpable for the reasons that Henry said. On the eve of the inauguration, the Republican leadership meets and they decide that they're not going to do anything to support President Obama, certainly on the Economic Recovery Act. But when we had the committee, what was so interesting, when we had the committee have hearings, as Henry said, on both healthcare and cap and trade, it was industry, consumer groups together had forged consensus on these things to sort of pave the way. A lot of those interests were aligned with Republicans, but they didn't bring the Republicans along with them in the political process. And when I remember during markups of the health bill, there were a couple Republicans who wanted to come into play. They wanted to play with the toy, and see what they could get. And we were interested in that, and we set up some back channels of discussions. We won't name names, but ultimately they were reined in by their leaders and say, no, you're not going to do bipartisan amendments with Henry Waxman and get them into the bill and then create a basis. We were on the floor on cap and trade in the committee. Remember Mary Bono Mack, who, because of particular concerns in her district, wanted an environmental bill. And there were several Republicans on final passage in the House of Cap and Trade who came and supported the bill. But it was very, very limited. So the partisanship was in your face all the time. It's worse today, but at the time, it was very intense.
Was it even sort of on like behind the scenes, out of public, were you like going to your separate sides to eat your sandwiches?
Yeah, I didn't. Yeah. I mean, we didn't.
They were trying to eat our lunch.
Before we turn to the audience, I want to go to the scholarly observer here. But you had also worked in the House earlier. When you look at this period of incredibly productive lawmaking, but also incredibly the roots of a lot of the partisanship, maybe it wasn't the roots of it, but we were beginning to see a new kind of partisanship emerge. If you were like, if this was your freshman intro political science course, what would you be telling them about that moment in time?
It's
even though they were there, right?
Yeah, you asked me about some pivot points along the way, right?
Yeah.
And so, looking back in the 1970s, you had Congressman Bob Michaels, who was, a minority leader at the time in the House. He would be one that had this phrase, I think, go along to get along, right? And so the idea behind the minority party at the time was, work with the majority, get what you can get, be productive, get something in return, but legislate, do things. And so I think that role decayed over time, died away, and you had Newt Gingrich come in 1994, kind of the guerrilla warrior, who did a lot of things that I think propelled the leadership to where they are now, including cut committee staffs, eliminated committees in the House. So he did a number of things that undermined, I think, institutionally what Congress could do, and made the rank and file more dependent on the party leadership to some extent. Because, I mean, members want to get reelected, they want to pass good policy, they want to do these kinds of things. And if the committee isn't strong enough, if they take away, resources from committees, that's going to make the members more dependent on the party leaders and make the party leaders stronger. And so I think those were some important pivot points that kind of go along to where we are, at least institutionally. And then you have the electoral changes over time with voters kind of sorting themselves out by party and ideology, especially starting in the 1980s, 1990s, and kind of continuing today. So you don't have voters, for example, that cast their vote for, one vote for a House member of one party and Senate of another party, or for president of one party and for their House member of another party. You don't have that kind of ticket splitting anymore like you did back in the 1980s and before. So, I mean, you have this kind of sorting out electorally that also kind of drives polarization.
Do any of you see a way back? Do any of you see, at some point, people in this country will have to figure out how to talk to one another. There are a couple of Republican staffers here who had enough respect and interest to come here from the legacy you left. At some point, not talking or only shouting isn't really good for a country. So do you see, what's going to take?
Well, I'm an optimist, and I think can you hear me without this? Or? Okay, I'm an optimist, and I think people come to Congress because they want to do something. I was taken aback to the situation that we have where you get a must-pass bill just to keep the government going.
Or the debt ceiling was part of the vote,
The
too.
debt
That
ceiling.
became a political
The
bargaining point.
appropriations bills. You have to get some things done, and they end up being held hostage. But I think that we've got to get members to look at an issue and then try to focus on how do you deal with this issue. When I came to Congress, it was a different kind of Congress, but it wasn't all that different. We had Democrats and Republicans who represent their geographical different districts, and they try to think about what approach to a problem they might entertain. And I always, as a Democrat, tried to hear what they had to say and often changed legislation when they made a very good point. I think when you have both parties working together, you get a much better product in the legislation. I think the ACA would have been a better bill had the Republicans worked with us, since it had so many things that they wanted in legislation, but they didn't want to work on it at all. And there is no piece of legislation I've ever seen pass the Congress where a follow-up bill just to correct some of the problems in major legislation that passes doesn't go through right away. And Republicans said, we're not going to let you clean up any errors in the Affordable Care Act. The only thing we want is to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Well, I still have optimism. And one of the things that we're doing at Waxman Strategies, where I was appointed chairman.
What was the vote?
I won the single vote that was needed. That was my son's vote. Michael Waxman started Waxman Strategies, and he said, come and work with us, and I'll make you chairman. And I said, well, that sounds pretty good, because I couldn't be chairman on the Hill. We were in the minority. And so and people could still call me Mr. Chairman. He said, that's great. Just know that I'm the president and the CEO. I said, that's okay. But one of the things that we're doing is trying to tackle the problem of high pharmaceutical prices, which we tackled in the 80s when we adopted the Hatch-Waxman Act, the Orphan Drug Act, other pay-fors for FDA to get user fees to help them accomplish what we wanted the FDA to do. These were bipartisan bills. And we said, let's not come in with an agenda of things to do, but set up problems and possible solutions. And Bill Corr is here, who worked on the early legislation. He came back too. He worked on the early legislation for the Hatch-Waxman and the Orphan Drug Act, went off to do things in the Senate, and became the #2 at HHS under the Democrats. And we're now working for some foundations to try to get bipartisan support. If you look at a problem and you want to solve the problem, there are different ways to solve it. If you want to ignore it, there's easy to ignore it. But we think we can enlist people into an agenda where they could look it over. And look, I authored a lot of legislation from the Clean Air Act to a lot of the Medicare, Medicaid laws, the Orphan Drug Act, the Hatch-Waxman Act, and a lot of others. The only
And also
bill,
leader on AIDS. You were the one who got
HIV,
the
AIDS,
HIV
acid
funding
rain.
grant.
acid rain. Anyway, the only bill that I ever authored that didn't have bipartisan support was the Affordable Care Act. And it's an amazing thing to have happen, that they wouldn't even cooperate in trying to design legislation where they'd be part of it. They did that to Hillary Clinton when she proposed the health bill in her husband's administration, but they wouldn't cooperate on anything. I went over to Joe Barton, who was the ranking Republican on the committee. I said, look, let's work together on these issues. It doesn't have to be one way or the other. Let's work together on the climate bill. And he said to me, why do I want to work to solve a problem that I don't think exists? I don't think there is a problem with climate change. That'd be like my coming to you and say, let's work on lowering the amount of money that goes to Israel. I didn't quite see the equivalence, but he said that the climate bill, coming from a state of Texas where they had a lot of oil people, he didn't see a way to compromise. So we've got to enlist people to look for compromises and get some things done. And we used to have deadlines to drive it. Now people don't even care about the deadlines, even though that could throw our economy into turmoil if we don't raise the debt ceiling, if we don't fund the government. And we've had that kind of clash.
Let's ask some audience questions. How do we deal with the mic? Well, this one's easy. You can take it right here.
I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School now, but I came to town and was the first person hired on the Peace Corps staff 2 days before Kennedy announced it. That's just a background statement. I was struck when it was clear Trump was going to win that clearly a problem we have is that our general public doesn't have a clue about how government works. And I'm struck by how the academic system doesn't seem to help. My view is we have to write stories for what I'm going to call 11-year-olds.
What's your question?
How do we make that happen? How do we get stories written so the general public can understand how it works?
Do you want to talk about the role of fake news?
Yeah, well, that's certainly one big issue, right? Is that we hope we live in a world of facts, but we're getting to this point where someone else's facts is not somebody else's facts, and so how do you come to some kind of agreement about going forward to solve a problem when you can't even agree on the facts?
I think there are times when people do have a strong appreciation of Congress and how it works. During Watergate, the House Judiciary Committee hearings, the Watergate hearings, were the textbook for a generation of people as to what a responsible Congress acts in a bipartisan fashion. I think when the first term of the Obama, when the members passed, the House passed, and Congress enacted so much of the law, I think people were genuinely excited about it, and they felt an agenda was being addressed. But under attack, and when you have a leadership in the Congress that absolutely capitulates to the president of whoever is in power and is supine and doesn't fulfill its constitutional responsibilities as a coordinate, co-equal branch of the government to hold the executive to account. That's the role of the Congress. Well, then faith and knowledge and salience about what's going on in Congress falls away. So we all have a responsibility, but I think a new dynamic time there are cycles in politics. And as bad as things look now, things will change. And I think there's a new wave of activism. I think you see it bubbling up in the primary elections, from the woman in New York to Lamb in Pennsylvania, people in Texas. And it's not top-down driven. It's not driven by the House leadership. These are people coming up who's saying we need to engage with things. So that gives me optimism too.
And the voter enthusiasm is on both sides, actually. The degree of engagement, according to the latest, I think it was a Pew poll, shows that the heightened engagement, you might not like what that portends in November, but the fact that people are engaged, I think most people in this room would believe that engagement is a good thing.
Yeah.
Another question over here? Can you stand and talk, or do we have, here, we have a
Where's
mic.
the
A
mic?
mic is coming.
I was just wondering if anything is being done with the pharmaceutical people who are charging the most outrageous prices for drugs for people. What is being done about
You're
that?
still working on this.
Well, I'm very involved in that, trying to work with members on both sides of the aisle to come to terms with the structure that there are things we can do, but there's a structure in place which envisioned incentives for development of new breakthrough drugs, but competition. And the problem has been that those who have the breakthrough drugs and a virtual monopoly over their drug don't want competition. And that competition has been blocked over and over again. So we're trying to get members of Congress to say, hey, let's let market forces work. And they always argue they're for market forces. And we hope that Congress will take appropriate action to restore some of those market forces. And then there are other things we can do as well. And we're looking at that.
Question back there? There's the mic's coming to you, and then I'll get to you.
Mr. Chairman Waxman, I'll call you Chairman since you still are Chairman. Given the similar situation we have with Mr. President Trump, as Obama had, how paranoid do you think the Democratic leadership and Democrats are to make Trump a one-term president, and therefore your strategies, or even though you say, as Chairman Waxman, your company is working for bipartisanship, will that work?
Look, partisanship wasn't just developed when Obama became president. We've had two parties fighting with each other for a very long period of time. And we always respected that the major high point of issues and differences were going to be emphasized to try to win adherence to a philosophy and an agenda of the Democrats or the Republicans. But my argument is that aside from that, there are areas where we could work together. And I've always tried to encourage that happening. And the truth of the matter is, before Trump became president, the only things that became law while the Republicans controlled the Congress and Obama was president were things that we agreed to on a bipartisan basis. Then we got them signed into law, and everybody felt good about it. But are we paranoid? Well, we want to win. We want to win the support of the voters, and we'll make arguments to them. But I don't think that that's the reason for our opposition to a lot of the Trump agenda. It's not because we want him to fail. It's because he supports things that we strongly disagree with. We did not want to repeal the Affordable Care Act, his #1 agenda, even though in the campaigns he said, I'll never touch Medicare or Medicaid. And then he supports a proposal to destroy Medicaid, as well as repeal the Affordable Care Act. The Republicans are having a tough time dealing with some of the trade issues. There's some Democrats that support what he's doing on trade. I think some of them are mistaken, but nevertheless, you got some bipartisan support. Are we paranoid? Well, we've got our differences highlighted, and that's what the people will have to decide when they vote.
The woman in the blue dress over here.
Most women have dresses on.
Good afternoon. John McKelligot. I work at an association that represents members of the U.S. Public Health Service. My question, though, is about the breadth of the committee. So that was early in your discussion. You talked about the institution and how it's evolved. Is there too much in the committee? Should the committee be broken up into something, and what would that look like?
No, I don't think so. I mean,
Never.
Never. Don't touch that guy. It works. It's authoritative in the areas. It is competent. It has demonstrated competence under this current past leadership. It's demonstrated competence in the areas for which it has responsibility. So I don't see any reason why it has to be broken up. It does its job, and I think it's fine. And it doesn't all fit together. It's not one single issue entity, but they are complementary, and the constituencies affected are complementary. So I think it works.
So the woman
There's
over
a woman
was
here.
here.
Yeah.
We were trying to. It's coming to you now, right?
Hi, my name is Dawn Lee Carty from Speak Life, and I'm going to circle back around with the pharmaceutical issues. I am a medicinal cannabis advocate and activist. I've been actively fighting for medicinal cannabis therapy for 3 years. My daughter, Zoe, who's now 10, was born with epilepsy, and she would have up to 60 seizures a day. I introduced her to every pharmaceutical that the neurologist and epidemiologist has given Zoe to no avail. And about 3 years ago, I flew out to Colorado and got her first batch of CBD oil, and she's now like 90% seizure free. Yeah. So I can speak from experience and just living every day about medicinal cannabis, and we fight every day.
Can you formulate a question, please? Because we're going to run out of time.
Okay, I'm sorry. We fight every day for the legalization of it, and I recently just worked on a campaign with Allison Galbraith, who's running for Congress. Andy Harris. We authored this bill, and the DC voters passed on it, and then he just came back and submitted a rider, which stopped the sales of medicinal cannabis therapy. Where do you see pharmaceuticals, which I know that medicinal cannabis is their rivalry, but where do you see medicinal cannabis future, as well as trying to merge with pharmaceutical, if that's possible?
I assume that's a question to me.
I think so.
The states, many states, have adopted legislation, sometimes on the ballot, which is what we did in California, to allow the use of cannabis, medicinal cannabis, and make it available. Some states have made it widely available, and we've left it up to the states. President Trump has said he thinks it's a state decision, but his Attorney General Sessions said, oh, he's not going to allow that. He's going to try to put up barriers to it. So we don't have a coherent position at the federal level, but there's bipartisan support for letting states act. Senator Gardner from Colorado has taken that issue up. So I think we've got to push for states to continue to make the decision. And I think we ought to make sure that research projects funded by the federal government ought to include the possibility of cannabis as a control, cure, prevention to deal with diseases.
No, that's fine.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Lauren. I'm actually from Connor Lamb's district before they
good.
redistricted all of Pennsylvania, and my question deals with Democrats running. I think John Lovett said that Democrats are good at governing but not good at running. How do you propose that Democratic candidates really connect with people and show them that they're the party that should be in power?
Several of us probably want to comment on that, but just briefly, again, I see this bubble up phenomenon, and when Henry was elected that was right after Watergate, and a wave of and the Vietnam War was on, and so a wave of anti-war, pro-popular government emerged, and you had, just on our committee, you had Henry, you had Tim Wirth, you had Al Gore, a whole bunch of superstars, and it's in subsequent, I think it's almost sociological, subsequent generations, great minds, they went to Wall Street, they went to Eastern Europe when the communism came down, they went into law firms, they went into IT. Now I think they're coming back, some in mid-career, to say, I want public service to get to deal with some of these issues. So I'm encouraged by what's coming, what we will see, and I hope across the spectrum, energized people just really committed to trying to do some good as they see it. But Bryan, you want to?
I'm encouraged by Connor Lamb winning.
Yes. Bryan, you want to
come in?
Sure, I would just say, kind of electorally, I think it's really important for Democrats to have at least a few things that kind of tie Democrats together. But you know, I think largely there's so much variation across the country, especially for constituencies that Democrats are running for, that they have to pay attention to those particular areas. You know, what are the concerns of their constituents? I mean, after all, you know, members represent. It's one of the beautiful things, right? They represent those local interests, and so I think Democrats have historically been a big tent party, and we saw on the 111th how they were able to effectively make that work. And so I think that's a formula that can work for policy and for re-election for them.
I think one of the themes in the book, the diary portion of the book, is how you had to sort of work with different factions within the party. I mean,
Yeah.
it's more somewhat more
There
uniform now.
were 50 to 60 blue dogs. There's going to be another generation of blue dogs. Connor Lamb will be one, and that Henry could pass legislation and keep them on board at the end of the day was an amazing feat, and that's going to be a test of leadership going forward. It's just not, the Democratic Party is just not going to be New York City. It shouldn't be. It has to represent all. You want a Congress to stand for all the people. You want a president to stand for all the people. So it's really a test of, it's the acid test of leadership. Can you keep your caucus together and do good at the same time?
A couple, like 2 more questions, and I think we probably need to, Howard, go way back there after this one, and then we'll.
Me first.
Yes.
My name is Paula Gordon, and I have a website called GordonDrugAbusePrevention.com, and I had been a consultant to the National Institute of Mental Health in the early days of the drug problem, and continued to work hard on that issue. I wanted to respond to some of the things that have been said here about cannabis. It seems that...
Can we stick to the topic of the committee?
Well, I want to ask you if you would consider the medical research, the voluminous medical research concerning cannabis, and the breaking information about cannabis and its connection to reproductive problems, and even the organizations which are promoting the legalization of marijuana, all kinds of marijuana, are saying that males should not use marijuana if they are considering starting a family, and females should not use marijuana either because of its effect on the ova and the sperm for men. And all of this is just the tip of the iceberg, but there are major issues like this that are not being adequately addressed or understood or even acknowledged.
Okay, thank you. We'd like to talk, we have a few more minutes. We'd
Yeah.
like to talk about the book and the committee, but thank you for
You
voicing
raise
your
a very
concerns.
good point, and
Safety concerns.
Thank you.
There's
and I think part of that has been the censorship of even research on cannabis over the years, so that it was excluded from what we would ordinarily think of as a FDA process, where you look at the safety and efficacy of it, and people decided efficacy seems to work in some medical conditions, and how can you withhold it? But I certainly would feel more comfortable if we had more research.
I also want to say that in the committee, when hearings were constructed and the staff worked to do it, we wanted broad views so that everything was aired, so that people felt they had a voice and they could be listened to. It was very important, and that's how we did business.
all the way back in the corner there. Can I get the man in, all the way, that's former staffer in the back, I'd like, okay, and then. there.
So, given how controversial the Affordable Care Act has been, and you touched on that a little bit, I was curious how either a single-payer healthcare plan or a completely kind of socialized medical plan would work, or how it could be implemented in a more efficient and, I guess, overall a better way. I just was interested to hear your opinions on how that would work, especially in our current political situation, if you want to call it.
May I take that? Look, it was difficult to pass the Affordable Care Act. And the Affordable Care Act dealt with one segment, people who wanted to buy an individual policy. It was being attacked as socialized medicine, government-run medicine, death panels by the federal government, on and on and on. And we had 60 votes in the Senate. We had a big majority in the House. So keep that in mind. If people tell you, let's do something like a single-payer Medicare for all, that might be my goal has always been universal coverage. Everybody ought to be able to get health insurance.
And afford it.
Affordable health insurance. And so we built on the system that we have to get things done. If we said we're not going to do anything until we get to the ultimate goal of government-run healthcare, we probably have nothing, and I'm not sure that goal makes sense. And I'm going to take a shot at a group in town that I ordinarily agree with. It's a Nader offshoot called Public Citizens, and they have a fundraising letter that really annoys me because I've respected the group in the past, and they say, if you want single-payer Medicare for all, send them money. And it said that everything's going to now be covered. Long-term care, you'll never have co-payments, you'll never have out-of-pocket costs. They don't say how we're going to pay for something like that. The tax increases we'd have to achieve to do that would be enormous unless they do something else, which is Medicare, which is slimmed down. A lot of people in this room know about Medicare. Some people don't. I'm on Medicare. You have to buy supplemental insurance for Medicare. So I just think that Democrats shouldn't be over-promising for something that cannot be achieved, and we ought to keep working for the goal of universal coverage. And then my last point on this is what is often neglected when we talk about the Affordable Care Act were provisions to try to move health care, however you're covered, in a direction where we're paying for quality and not quantity of care. And that's so important. And it affects private insurance and Medicare and individual insurance, trying to drive a healthcare system that would make more rational decisions than what we have when you have very different healthcare coverage.
Okay.
That's a showstopper.
Good afternoon. I'm John Osthouse. I'm a retired staff member of the Appropriations Committee in the House.
Good to see you, John.
But I wanted to ask you about the effect of the Hastert Rule on efforts today even to address the problems in the Affordable Care Act. It seems to me that both Republicans, and some Republicans and Democrats want to try to fix things, but it also seems to me that this Hastert rule has been a major roadblock in addressing those problems.
The Hastert rule, named after former Speaker Hastert, was that they would not put anything on the House floor unless a majority of the Republicans agreed to it. And so it, of course, would prevent minority Republicans from joining minority of Democrats and supporting any legislation. I think we never had that on the Democratic side. It shouldn't be the basis for making those kinds of decisions. And it empowered a minority of Republicans to keep on fighting against sensible compromises. I don't even know if the Hastert rule is effective anymore. There's so much infighting on the Republican side that it's hard for it was hard for Boehner, it's hard for, what's the guy's name? Bryan. And I don't know who the successor will be for the minority leader.
Who's the chairman of the committee today?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. And we ought to let Congress decide things on a majority basis.
That's it.
Okay. We go all the way back to the back corner, all the way in the, who's someone who has history with the committee and wants to ask a question.
Thank you. My name is Howard Cohn. I worked on the Committee Energy and Commerce for a number of years for the Republicans. Okay. I want to just say two things right up front. Chairman Waxman is the Joe DiMaggio, or for you younger ones, the Mike Trout of legislation. Okay. We probably won't see another one again. And the staff that I worked with, particularly on healthcare issues, was not just all-star, it was Hall of Fame. It was the best. I love the title of your book, Bruce, The Committee, because we all love the Energy and Commerce Committee in particular.
It's an HBO special with George Clooney, okay? Actually, Mark Rycroft is going to play Henry.
Okay, that's right.
And Clooney's going to play me.
So, my question is sort of a bipartisan one. I think we've all are saddened about, and it began with Gingrich, I have to admit that committees have become less relevant and less powerful, and I think it was even true in the ACA. As leadership on both the Democrat and Republican side and in the Senate has pulled more and more into their bailiwick to the level that they write the bills and seem to now dictate to the committees. And I think that's, not just extremely sad, it's tremendously detrimental, and I think it's one of the reasons, among others, that the ACA was drafted in such a fundamentally flawed way, that ENC in Ways and Means never really got their chance in a conference to rewrite the bill. So I just want your comments about, particularly about that, because I think it's an ongoing issue as we speak right now on both sides. I mean, on both Republican and Democrats.
I think it's for you, Henry.
My view is that I don't like to say nice things about Newt Gingrich, but I think he's getting an unfair rap about centralizing things in the leadership. Look at the historical perspective. The Congress used to be run by committee chairmen, most of whom came from the South, and they were still Democrats, and they got to be chairmen because they had seniority, and they didn't advance legislation that a majority of the Democrats wanted. So if we look back to the Kennedy years, they didn't know how they can get any legislation through, like civil rights, to the floor because the chairman of the Rules Committee wouldn't give it a rule to be considered on the House floor, and they had to go around that. So we were faced with two powerful committees and autocratic chairs. So the reforms that my class participated in, as part of a spectrum of reform, was to make the chairs answerable to the caucus, try to broaden and democratize the decision-making. But it was always that dilemma of how much power do you give the committee and how much power do you centralize in the caucus or in the leadership. And Newt Gingrich centralized it, over-centralized it. He decided who the chairs would be. He decided the legislation. He gave them the drafts. and that was too much. Pelosi had to deal with giving the committees enough power to do their job and develop an expertise and write legislation, but not to have committees go off in different directions so that the bills couldn't be reconciled. So she worked with the committee chairs on the Affordable Care Act and on the cap and trade bill and a lot of other legislation to get a bill that could pass and recognize the dignity and work of the committee, but not to let the committees be so arbitrary and independent. That's the balance that has to be achieved. Gingrich centralized it too much. Pelosi pulled it back. Now it's centralized again, but they're not doing anything. I don't know how many times we had to vote to repeal the Affordable Care Act. 50 times, 60 times?
Yeah.
65 times? 55 times for the House to vote to repeal the Affordable Care. Well, if it was a message, they could have done it, with 10 times. So it became nonsensical. So we've got to have more of a way for the majority to work its will, but to try to develop legislation, not to ignore the differing points of view in the Congress, such as the minority and other points of view based on regional differences.
Should we, one or two more questions? Or if you're still questions, we can sit here for a few minutes. So we'll give it a few more and then we'll wrap it up.
Hi, Ed Hunter. I want to ask a question about oversight. And you, of course, were chairman of both committees in addition to the chairmanship you hold now. Looking at the next Congress, not necessarily a chance for a lot of substantive legislating, but in the oversight role and the energy and commerce oversight role, there was a lot of substance that set up future legislative activity. Where do you see in the theoretical scenario the Democrats hold the House, where does the committee go? What does oversight do to set up the next agenda for what you do in healthcare?
Good question. Congress has two responsibilities, to legislate and to do oversight. And I believe that oversight often is more important than the legislation, because when we held hearings, either in the Committee of Jurisdiction, which was the Energy and Commerce Committee, or a separate oversight committee, which had oversight over everything, we could focus in on an issue, hold people accountable. It could be the basis for legislation, or sometimes just solving the problem by drawing attention to it. So I think oversight is very, very important for the Congress and for the committees to do. If the Democrats take back the House and not the Senate, and obviously not the presidency after this 2018 election, I think there will be a lot of oversight. What I hope is not just politics, because when the Republicans have been in charge, they think oversight is a power they can use for their politics. So when I became the ranking member of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, there was the chairman, Dan Burton, and he just abused the power because he wanted to advance the theory that Bill Clinton was an agent of communist China. And he had his own agenda, but he didn't use oversight for legitimate purposes. When we became in charge of oversight and had a role in it, even with the Republican chairman, Tom Davis, we wanted to use it for very legitimate purposes. How did FEMA respond to the Hurricane Katrina? What happened to the people who were displaced? Why were they living in dwellings that had formaldehyde? We wanted to know what was going on with the Navajo community population, that where there was never a cleanup of the atomic nuclear tailings that were in that community, as opposed to other areas that did have government attention. We wanted to see what the Bush administration was doing in national security when they advanced a war into Iraq based on false premises that they had nuclear weapons. And it was false. And we went through and itemized all the reasons that it was false and all the things that they were saying that were untrue. We stuck to the issues. Republicans had oversight, and what did they? Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton did this. Hillary Clinton did that. And even now, their oversight hearings are Joe McCarthy would be embarrassed by them. So they use it only for political purposes. But if we can have oversight hearings about how these decisions are being made by the Trump administration without making it so political, I think we would have an enormous impact. And that's what I hope Democrats will do under the guidance of Phil Lero and Phil Barnett, advising them how to do oversight.
I was misinformed. I thought Bill Clinton was working for the Russians.
Wrong presidency.
Bill Clinton?
Yeah, Bill Clinton.
Oh.
Can you
Maybe Trump.
wait, one more? Should we have one more question? Then I'll wrap up with the quote that I wrote down from the book that I think summarizes a lot of sort of where we are now. Right here.
How about the young person there who has a mic?
Okay.
Hello, my name is Marcus, and I've been in DC for the past week, and I found myself asking the question.
How did you end up
How
here
do I
today?
get a job?
And I found myself asking the question, to what extent do outside funds influence our congressmen and our senators? And because of that, do you think our senators and congressmen are acting more for the parties and more for the organizations, or do you think they're acting more for the people?
I want to say one thing historically on this. Money washes through the system. This man always acted on principle, and there was never a decision made that was influenced by a special interest saying, I can't support you unless you. That just never entered into the equation with Henry running the committee and how we did business.
Well, that's very nice.
It's also true. It's also true.
It's basically true, but I represented a district, and I wanted to represent my constituency.
Well, Hollywood was really.
I did want to know what the Hollywood entertainment industry had to say about legislation. Yeah. They didn't tell me what to do, and there was a time I didn't do what they wanted, and they got pretty upset about it. But politics in representing districts and constituency means you need to be mindful of your constituents. And if the constituents get together in an organization and they have ties to national organizations, and they even have PACs, there's nothing illegitimate about that. What is so disturbing is the source of money that doesn't come by way of contributions to the candidates. It comes to these super PACs as a result of the Citizens United, which unleashes so much money where the candidate doesn't have a say over what they say in their commercials. The party is not involved in it. It could be a group like the Koch brothers who come in with something off the wall, but they think it's going to be effective, and if they could say it over and over again, it might be effective. So I think I'd like to see more strength in the parties and more ability of the candidates to say what they believe in and let the election be based on that, and have money limited where it comes from and some limits on how much is spent.
Bryan, as a scholar who's watched Congress,
Bryan.
Has there ever been a point where, what are you coming safely from the safe distance of Ohio? What does the money look like here?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think Congressman Waxman hit the nail on the head. That I think the way voters see it is the everyday voter. We don't necessarily pay attention to the amount of money or the awash of money that politicians have, but and that's part of the negative aspect of it is that it's so much of the spending now is transparent. We don't know who's running these ads, right? We don't know who's spending the money, who's supporting this issue, that issue. It's all kind of dark money now, and so that's what makes it incredibly, I think, dangerous.
There ought to at least be disclosure. And Republicans have stopped that from happening when all this money was unleashed in the system.
Right. Okay, I think we should probably wrap up now. I should tell the young man who asked that question, are you interning? Are you here? You're here as a visitor? Oh, a student. Okay, but if you at some point in your GW career you will be an intern, and the one good thing about all the money in town is there's a lot of receptions you can eat free at. I just wanted to read one sentence that I wrote down as I was reading.
Things too?
What?
The press went to those things too, huh?
I often only drink the water.
Not Joanne.
I remember trying to explain to Senator Stevens why I wouldn't eat the Alaska crab, but I'll tell you that later. The one, the sentence I wrote down, and I think this was actually from the chapter on the deep, the oil spill, the BP bill they were trying to pass, and you were bringing in the executives, which was sort of a stylistic thing you did with great success, starting with the tobacco executives. And what you wrote about this, I guess it was on the eve of the hearing. If you have the substance, the materials, and the facts at hand, you can control the narrative. And it made me a little nostalgia for facts.
Thank you, Joanne.